"You're being selfish keeping all that money when I'm struggling to feed our kids," Sarah said, while secretly transferring $47,000 to her boyfriend. She thought I was blind, but I had proof of everything. My wife of 12 years had been playing the devoted mother and struggling spouse perfectly, always asking for more money for household expenses and emergency repairs that never seemed to get fixed. What she didn't know was that I'd installed monitoring software on our shared computer after noticing some suspicious activity, and I'd been building a case that would destroy her carefully constructed lies. It started 6 months ago when I noticed our savings account dropping faster than usual. Sarah had always handled most of the day-to-day finances while I focused on growing my consulting business, but something felt off. When I asked about the unusual spending, she'd get defensive and accuse me of not trusting her with money. She'd bring up how hard she worked taking care of our 2 kids, Emma and Jake, and how I was never around to see what she was dealing with. I'm Marcus, and I've been busting my ass for over a decade to build something solid for my family. Started my IT consulting firm right after college, worked 80-hour weeks for years to get established, and finally reached the point where we were comfortable. Not rich, but comfortable enough that Sarah could stay home with the kids like she wanted, and we could afford a nice house in a good school district. The thing about Sarah is that she's always been good with people. Charismatic, persuasive, the kind of person who can make you feel like you're the problem even when you know something's wrong. She had this way of twisting conversations so that by the end, I'd be apologizing for bringing up my concerns in the first place. For years, I thought this was just her personality, maybe a little dramatic but basically good-hearted. But that morning when she accused me of being selfish, something in her tone was different. There was a coldness there, like she was reading from a script she'd practiced. And the way she specifically mentioned our kids instead of just the kids felt calculated, like she was trying to make me feel guilty for questioning her spending. That's when I decided to dig deeper into our finances. What I found over the next few weeks made my blood run cold. Sarah hadn't just been overspending on household items. She'd been systematically draining our accounts to fund her affair with Derek, a guy she'd met at the gym who was trying to start some kind of fitness equipment business. The emergency home repairs were actually cash withdrawals she was giving him. The kids' activities that kept getting more expensive were cover for expensive dinners and weekend trips they were taking together. But the worst part was discovering that she'd been planning this for months. I found emails between them discussing how to maximize what they could get from me before filing for divorce. Derek had actually coached her on how to hide assets and create a paper trail that would make it look like I was financially irresponsible. They were planning to claim I was gambling or had some kind of addiction to explain where the money went. The level of calculation was staggering. Sarah had been taking photos of our house, documenting every expensive item we owned, researching divorce lawyers, and even consulting with a private investigator about how to prove I was an unfit father. All while playing the loving wife who just needed a little more money to keep our family afloat. What really got to me was reading their messages about our kids. Sarah was discussing how to use Emma and Jake as leverage, how to make sure they'd choose to live with her, and how to maximize child support payments. She talked about them like they were assets in a business deal, not the children we'd raised together. I spent weeks documenting everything. Screenshots of bank transfers, copies of their email exchanges, records of her lies about where she was going and what she was doing. I even hired my own investigator to get photos of them together, just to make sure I had ironclad proof of the affair. The hardest part was acting normal while I built my case. Coming home every day to Sarah asking for more money, listening to her complain about how stressed she was, watching her hug our kids while knowing she was planning to use them as weapons against me. There were moments I wanted to confront her immediately, but I knew I needed to be strategic. My lawyer, Janet, was clear about the situation. "She's been planning this for months, Marcus. If you confront her now without solid evidence, she'll just accelerate her timeline and you'll be playing defense. Better to let her think she's winning until we're ready to strike back." So I played along. When Sarah asked for an extra $1,000 for back-to-school shopping, I gave it to her, knowing it was probably going straight to Derek's business account. When she claimed the washing machine was broken and needed to be replaced, I handed over the cash, even though I'd checked and it was working perfectly fine. The breaking point came when I discovered she'd been telling people in our neighborhood that I was having financial problems. She was setting up a narrative where I was the irresponsible one, the husband who couldn't provide for his family properly. She'd even convinced my own mother that I was being secretive about money and that she was worried about our family's future. That's when I knew it was time to act. Sarah had crossed the line from stealing money to destroying my reputation, and she was involving our children in her lies. Emma had started asking me why Mommy was always worried about money, and Jake had mentioned that Mommy said Daddy might have to sell the house soon. I called Janet and told her it was time to file. We had everything we needed: evidence of the affair, proof of the financial fraud, documentation of her plans to manipulate the custody situation, and records of her attempts to damage my reputation. More importantly, we had evidence that she was using our children's emotional well-being as a weapon. The morning I served Sarah with divorce papers, I also presented her with a complete financial audit of our accounts, copies of all her communications with Derek, and a restraining order preventing her from accessing our joint accounts or removing our children from the state. Her reaction was exactly what I expected. First, complete denial. She claimed the emails were fake, that someone must have hacked her account, that Derek was just a friend who needed help with his business. When I showed her the bank records proving she'd been lying about expenses for months, she switched to anger, accusing me of spying on her and violating her privacy. But the real Sarah came out when she realized her plan had failed. She started screaming about how I'd ruined everything, how Derek was going to leave her now that she couldn't access our money, how I'd destroyed her chance at happiness. Not once did she mention our children or express any regret about the damage she'd done to our family. The next few weeks were brutal. Sarah hired an aggressive divorce attorney and tried to paint me as a controlling husband who was financially abusing her. She claimed I'd cut off her access to money without warning, that I was trying to isolate her from her friends, that I was using our children as pawns in a vindictive divorce. But Janet had prepared for this. Every claim Sarah made, we had documentation proving the opposite. When she said I was financially controlling, we showed the court records of thousands of dollars in unexplained withdrawals she'd made. When she claimed I was isolating her, we presented evidence of her secret relationship and her plans to leave me. When she accused me of using our children, we showed the court her own emails discussing how to manipulate custody arrangements. What made things even more complicated was that Sarah had been building alliances with other people in our social circle. She'd been having coffee dates with the other moms from our kids' school, carefully planting seeds about how worried she was about our marriage, how I'd been working too much and seemed distant lately. She'd even started therapy with Dr. Peterson, a counselor she'd specifically chosen because she knew I'd never agree to couples counseling with him. The genius of her approach was that she was creating a paper trail of her being the concerned wife trying to save our marriage. She had session notes from Dr. Peterson documenting her efforts to improve our relationship, emails to marriage counselors asking about couples therapy, and even a journal she'd been keeping about our marital problems that painted me as an emotionally unavailable workaholic. But what Sarah didn't realize was that I'd been documenting her behavior too. I had recordings of her phone calls with Derek where she laughed about how easy it was to manipulate Dr. Peterson, how she was building a case for being the victim in our marriage. I had screenshots of her social media messages with her friends where she joked about playing the long game and how men were too stupid to see what was happening right in front of them. The most damaging evidence came from her own mother, Linda, who'd grown suspicious of Sarah's behavior. Linda had always been straight with me, and when she noticed Sarah suddenly having expensive clothes and going out more often, she started asking questions. Sarah had made the mistake of confiding in her mother about Derek, spinning it as an emotional affair that had developed because I was neglecting her. But Linda wasn't buying it. She'd seen how hard I worked to provide for our family, how I'd always made time for Emma and Jake despite my busy schedule. When Sarah started asking her mother to babysit more often so she could meet Derek, Linda became concerned about what was really happening. Linda came to me privately and told me about Sarah's request for childcare, her new expensive habits, and some concerning things she'd overheard during phone calls. She didn't want to betray her daughter, but she was worried about Emma and Jake, and she felt I deserved to know what was going on. That conversation with Linda was when I realized how deep Sarah's deception went. She hadn't just been stealing money and having an affair. She'd been systematically destroying our marriage while making it look like I was the problem. She'd been documenting every argument we had, every time I worked late, every moment when I seemed stressed or distracted, and spinning it into evidence that I was an unfit husband and father. The custody evaluation was particularly satisfying. Sarah had been so confident that she'd be seen as the primary caregiver, the devoted mother who'd sacrificed everything for her children. But when the evaluator interviewed Emma and Jake, they talked about how Mommy had been acting strange lately, always whispering on the phone, always asking them questions about Daddy's work and money. Emma, who's 10 and pretty perceptive, told the evaluator that Mommy had been teaching her to say that Daddy was always working and never spent time with them. But Emma also mentioned that she didn't understand why Mommy wanted her to lie, because Daddy actually spent lots of time with them and was always helping with homework and taking them places. Jake, who's 8, innocently mentioned Derek to the evaluator, describing him as Mommy's special friend who she goes to lunch with when we're at school. He also talked about how Mommy had been asking him lots of questions about what Daddy did at work and whether Daddy ever seemed worried about money. The evaluator's report was devastating for Sarah. It documented clear evidence of parental alienation attempts, inappropriate involvement of the children in adult financial matters, and concerning behavior that suggested she was not prioritizing the children's emotional well-being. But Sarah wasn't done fighting. When it became clear that she wasn't going to get primary custody or the financial settlement she'd planned for, she escalated to making false accusations. She claimed I'd been emotionally abusive, that I'd threatened her, that she was afraid for her safety. This is where having documented everything became crucial. I had recordings of our conversations, copies of our text messages, and witness statements from neighbors and friends who could testify about our interactions. When Sarah claimed I'd threatened her during a particular argument, I had audio of that entire conversation proving she was lying. The turning point came when Derek's ex-wife, Monica, reached out to me. She'd been following the divorce proceedings through mutual friends and wanted to warn me about what I was dealing with. Derek had pulled the same scam on her during their marriage, convincing her to fund his various business ventures while he was cheating on her with multiple women. Monica had documentation of Derek's pattern of financial manipulation, including emails where he specifically discussed targeting married women who had access to significant assets. She'd been building a case against him for fraud, and my situation with Sarah fit perfectly into the pattern she'd been tracking. Working with Monica and her attorney, we were able to prove that Derek had been running a systematic scheme to defraud married women through romantic manipulation. Sarah wasn't his first victim, and she probably wouldn't have been his last if we hadn't exposed him. The evidence Monica provided showed that Derek had coached Sarah on exactly how to manipulate me, how to create false documentation of marital problems, and how to maximize what she could extract from our marriage before filing for divorce. He'd even provided her with template emails and scripts for conversations with lawyers and therapists. When this information came to light during the divorce proceedings, Sarah's entire narrative collapsed. Her claims of being an innocent wife driven to infidelity by my neglect were exposed as part of a calculated fraud scheme. The court recognized that she'd been an active participant in a conspiracy to defraud me, not a victim of marital problems. The final blow came when Derek abandoned her. Once he realized that Sarah wasn't going to be getting a big divorce settlement, and that his business was being scrutinized as part of the financial investigation, he cut off all contact. Sarah had burned through her savings funding his failed business, destroyed her marriage, and damaged her relationship with our children, all for a guy who disappeared the moment things got complicated. But the story doesn't end there. Sarah's desperation led her to make increasingly poor decisions. She started borrowing money from friends and family, claiming she needed help with legal fees for the divorce. She maxed out credit cards that I didn't know existed, running up tens of thousands in debt that she tried to claim was marital debt that I should be responsible for. When her parents, Linda and Robert, realized what Sarah had been doing, they were horrified. They'd raised her to be better than this, and watching her destroy her family for a con artist was devastating for them. Linda testified on my behalf during the divorce proceedings, providing evidence of Sarah's lies and manipulation that even her own mother couldn't overlook. The impact on our social circle was significant. The other parents at Emma and Jake's school had initially been sympathetic to Sarah, believing her story about being married to a workaholic who didn't appreciate her. But when the truth came out about the affair and the financial fraud, the community turned against her completely. Sarah found herself isolated from the social network she'd been cultivating. The women she'd been having coffee with stopped returning her calls. The couples we'd been friends with made it clear they were supporting me and the kids. Even the gym where she'd met Derek asked her to find another place to work out, since her presence was causing drama among the other members. The divorce was finalized 8 months after I filed. I got primary custody of Emma and Jake, with Sarah getting supervised visitation until she could prove she was in therapy and had stable housing. The court ordered her to pay back the money she'd stolen from our accounts, plus interest and legal fees. She was also required to undergo a psychological evaluation before any changes to the custody arrangement could be considered. The financial settlement was everything I'd hoped for. Not only did I keep the house and most of our assets, but Sarah was ordered to pay me spousal support since she'd been unemployed during our marriage and had no current income. The court recognized that she'd been living off money she'd stolen from our joint accounts, and that I'd been the sole provider for our family. More importantly, the court awarded me attorney's fees and costs, recognizing that Sarah's fraudulent behavior had forced me to spend significant money defending myself against false accusations. The total amount she owed me was more than $75,000, money she had no way of paying given her current financial situation. But the real victory was protecting my children. Emma and Jake stayed in their home, kept going to their same schools, and maintained their relationships with their friends and activities. They were confused and hurt by the divorce, but they weren't traumatized by a custody battle or forced to choose between their parents. The impact on Sarah's extended family was also significant. Her sister Jessica, who'd initially supported her, became disgusted when she learned about the financial fraud and the impact on Emma and Jake. Jessica had children of her own and couldn't understand how Sarah could use her kids as weapons in a divorce. Sarah's brother Mike, who'd always been skeptical of her stories, felt vindicated when the truth came out. He'd suspected something was wrong when Sarah started asking family members for money, claiming I was being financially controlling. When he learned about Derek and the systematic fraud, he cut off contact with Sarah completely. The professional consequences for Sarah were severe as well. She'd been working part-time as a substitute teacher before the divorce, but when the school district learned about the fraud charges and the custody issues, they removed her from their substitute list. Her reputation in the community was destroyed, making it nearly impossible for her to find work locally. Derek faced his own consequences. The investigation into his business revealed that he'd been running similar scams on multiple women, using romantic relationships to fund his various failed ventures. He was charged with fraud and conspiracy, and Monica's divorce attorney was pursuing civil charges for the money he'd stolen from her. The ripple effects continued for months. Sarah's friends from her book club and yoga class distanced themselves from her once they learned about the affair and the financial manipulation. The narrative she'd been building about being an underappreciated wife crumbled when people realized she'd been lying to them for months. Sarah tried to appeal the custody decision, claiming the court had been biased against her. But her new lawyer took one look at the evidence and advised her to accept the arrangement. The documentation of her affair, financial fraud, and attempts at parental alienation made it clear that any appeal would likely result in even more restricted visitation rights. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court was particularly damaging for Sarah. The psychologist found evidence of narcissistic personality traits, a pattern of manipulative behavior, and a concerning lack of empathy for how her actions had affected our children. The report recommended continued therapy and supervised visitation until she could demonstrate genuine change in her behavior patterns. Emma and Jake's therapy sessions revealed the extent of the damage Sarah had tried to inflict on their relationship with me. The therapist documented multiple instances where Sarah had tried to turn them against me, asking them to spy on my activities and report back to her about my work and social life. But the children's resilience was remarkable. With consistent therapy and a stable home environment, they began to heal from the trauma of their mother's manipulation. Emma, in particular, showed remarkable insight for her age, understanding that her mother had been asking her to do things that weren't appropriate for a child. The financial investigation also revealed that Sarah had been planning her exit strategy for much longer than anyone realized. She'd been slowly moving money into accounts that Derek controlled, setting up a scenario where she could claim poverty while having access to significant funds through him. When Derek disappeared, Sarah lost access to all of that money. The accounts he'd controlled were frozen as part of the fraud investigation, leaving her truly destitute. The woman who'd been planning to take me for everything I had ended up with nothing, while I maintained financial stability for our children. The last time I saw Sarah was at the final court hearing. She looked completely different from the confident, manipulative woman who'd been stealing from our accounts just months earlier. The stress of the divorce, the financial pressure, and the social isolation had taken a visible toll. Derek was long gone. Most of her friends had distanced themselves after learning about the affair, and she was facing the reality of starting over at 40 with no money, no job, and limited access to her children. As we left the courthouse, she tried one last manipulation. She approached me and said she hoped we could work together for the kids' sake, that maybe we could try counseling to rebuild trust. But I could see in her eyes that she was still calculating, still looking for an angle to regain some control over the situation. I told her that our communication would go through our lawyers and the court-appointed mediator, that the children's well-being was my priority, but that didn't mean I was going to give her opportunities to manipulate them or me again. That she'd made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. The look on her face when she realized I wasn't going to give her another chance was something I'll never forget. For the first time in our entire relationship, Sarah had no power over me. No way to twist the situation, no emotional leverage to use, no financial dependency to exploit. She was facing the reality that her manipulations had finally caught up with her, and there was nothing she could do to change the outcome. Walking out of that courthouse with my children, knowing that our home was secure and that Sarah could never again use them as weapons against me, felt like finally being able to breathe after holding my breath for months. The woman who tried to destroy my life to fund her affair had lost everything, while the family she'd tried to break apart was stronger than ever.